and we need to spread around the resources in a much more equitable way. And I think there's so many ways to live a mission-driven life and sort of address these fundamental issues that are really hurting our country and hurting our world and hurting our planet.
And the mission-driven, you can put 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, build upon what you care about. No need for money. Find what your heart wants to do. Find a serviceable thing that you can get involved with. And that power creates another opportunity and another, and that snowball effect is very, very powerful. You don't have to save everything. What do you care about? Welcome to Super Life with me, Darren Oline, a podcast where we explore, discover, and share solutions that promote a healthier life and a better world. Together, we'll ignite possibilities, inspire change, and build sovereignty, creating a roadmap towards a super life for you and for all. Get ready to start living your super life. Welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here.
Yeah, man. So this is my kind of new rebranded Super Life, and Super Life is got tentacles in helping people live their best life, at the same time being advocate for our environment. And there's no better kind of entry into that than the kind of the origin story for you. And so I'm grateful you're here, man.
Well, man, I really appreciate you having me. Great respect for you and your work over the years. Great to be in California too, away from the rainy New York.
Oof. Yeah, we'll feel free to hang out. Yeah, it's like we're seeing a full surf lineup out there.
Yeah.
And the infamous pier. But anyway, so there's so much to get into with your story, because it is, in one respect, the origin of it, and I want to hear that from you, the origin of you fighting something that we all can understand, the devastating pollution of an oil company extracting from the precious Amazon, and the downstream horrible effect that has with very little, no oversight. And then at the same time, your story has been just riddled with distractions to that main point. Clearly, because they have a reason to do that. So I'd love to hear, going all the way back, like, why and how did you end up in the Amazon fighting? And I know you saw it, you've been there, you've seen the children, you've seen the cancers, you've seen the severe skin issues, you've seen the deformities, you've seen all this stuff, and you can't unsee that. I know I've been around the world in a lot of different places. I haven't seen specifically that, but I've seen some stuff. Yeah. And once you see stuff, and then you have abilities, being the environmental attorney, human rights attorney, blah, blah, blah. So you are actually equipped to...
That's a really good point, because it's one thing to like go there and see it. And I remember when I first went down there way back in April of 1993, it was my first trip to Ecuador in the Amazon to see this oil pollution. It's one thing to see it, but like the advantage of being a lawyer, and there's disadvantages to being a lawyer, but one advantage of being a lawyer is you're like, wait, we can actually do something about this. We can take these bastards to court, and we might not win the case, but we can drag them into court and put evidence in and make them deal with the evidence and make them deal with the public airing of their secrets, their dirty secrets about what they did down there. Because I guarantee you, when I first went down there in April of 93, and like, I couldn't believe what I saw. I mean, it was so much worse than I had expected, and I expected bad. I mean, there were like literally lakes of oil in these pits that had been gouged out of the floor of the Amazon rainforest, you know, near where indigenous peoples were living, near rivers and streams that local people were drinking out of to drink their water, you know. And I want people to understand, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. I now live in New York City. I went to a really good law school. I'm relatively privileged and I'm very educated in a formal sense. But when I went down there, like all that education, like I didn't know squat in terms of what was really going on until I went to Ecuador and had to learn from my clients, from the people down there about like what was really happening. And it was shocking to me. And as you said, like you see these things and you can't unsee them. Well, like you experience these things and you can't turn your back. And like, my career as a lawyer has not evolved how I thought it would when I was in law school, because basically at the very beginning of my career, I saw this, decided to work with other lawyers and these community leaders in Ecuador to do something about it. And here I am. I've been working on this for over 30 years. I've done many other cases, by the way, but I have been working on this one case for over 30 years. And Chevron, which now owns this problem, has continually refuses to deal with it. And they have invested significant sums of money, I would say over literally $1 billion, in paying lawyers largely to target me as a way to distract people's attention from what I would call environmental crimes that they committed in the Amazon that I saw on that first trip.
Right. And this is the thing that, is so thrown away.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not visual, we don't understand it, we don't see it, out of sight, out of mind for the normal person. We just get in our car, we put the fuel in, and we don't think about it. But then that chain of custody of that oil and that gas and that fuel, that has an origin, and that has an origin story.
Yes.
Right? And the way I can relate to that, I spent 20 years superfood hunting. So I was in the Amazon, and I was in the Andes, and I was in Southeast Asia. And so you start to see things and you understand like, oh, that's bad. That's good. That's not good for them. So from in my own little way, I can have deep empathy for I've seen destruction. I've seen it in the Amazon. I've seen, not to that degree, and I've seen it in the Cerrado of Brazil, like which is huge savanna. And it's so, I shed a tear over that stuff. So now you're seeing this stuff. You go to action, and I'm sure you're a bit like, let's just hold someone accountable. And so it was originally Texaco, right? Chevron acquired Texaco. And also, let's just describe this stuff a little bit. And we'll put a bunch of these links in, because there's some great YouTube videos that tell your story and show this stuff. Because again, it's been 30 years.
Right.
But, there's regulatory... there's regulation into how to dispose of stuff.
Right. Exactly.
And so when you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no real person, or it's easy to pay off people, payola happens all over the place. And then you create these pits, but they have no liners, there's nothing, right? Other than seepage into the ground and all of that stuff.
I mean, first of all, what they did, just so people understand the basics, they really did three things that were crazy, and that at the time they were doing it in Ecuador, they could not do in the United States.
And this was what?
Mostly 1970s.
70s, yeah.
80s, 70s, 80s. They started in 67, ended in 92. But these, what I'm about to describe was mostly an infrastructure built in the 70s and 80s. And I want to emphasize all this oil that I saw out there on that first trip, and that I've been there over 250 times, like working with my clients and investigating this and for the case. This is not an oil spill. I need to explain that. Okay, This is a deliberate engineering design that was intended to offload oil waste into the environment as a way to save on production costs. So they were already making huge profits. They elevated their profits to literally obscene levels in Ecuador by just dumping this stuff into the Amazon, where people had lived for thousands of years.
Because it's a line item that if you have to deal with something responsibly, there's a cost to
There's
that,
a
and
cost.
there's millions of gallons, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean, and literally, yeah, millions of gallons of this stuff there. But they weren't, it didn't just like, I mean, there were pipeline spills that were like accidental, but what they did, the real problem, that's a big problem, but a bigger problem is in a systematic, methodical way, like literally every day at the height of this operation, they were running about 5 million gallons of scalding hot water of production, which is the hot waters. It's really poison. It's got heavy metals, carcinogens that separates out from the marketable crude at these separation stations before they take the marketable crude through the pipeline over the Andes down to the Pacific coast, where, by the way, it gets on ships and gets refined and comes mostly here to California for people to use. Okay, this is all out of this experience, like ends up right where we're sitting right now. But the real problem was the wastewater that they had to separate out from the oil. They systematically dumped at the rate of 5 million gallons a day into rivers and streams that people were drinking out of or bathing in and fishing. And the problem with this wastewater, among many, I mean, first of all, it's poison. Second, if you actually look at it, like, it doesn't necessarily look anything other than clear water. There's nothing, it's not dirty, but in it are all these poisons, and it's hot as hell. It's very scalding hot. And it goes in these rivers, and over time, over years and years, it essentially poisoned an ecosystem that was about 1,500 square miles in size, on which 5 indigenous groups lived. And there were also farmer groups, because farmers from other parts of Ecuador had come down to the Amazon kind of on the back of the oil development to get land and to farm and relieve population pressures in other part of the country. So you have a mix of the indigenous groups and what they call colonizers from other parts of Ecuador who came to their territory. The legal case is both the indigenous groups and those who are non-indigenous who live in this area. And one of the nice things about what we've done with the case is both of these groups have combined forces to work as one class. It's basically a class action case together to try to solve this problem. And the colonists are always giving the indigenous peoples like the pole position. We're like, okay, you're going to get, if we ever collect on the damages, you're going to get extra damages to restore your cultures that have been decimated, by this process. Because generationally. But one thing that happens when you dump oil waste over this precious ecosystem is the forest can no longer sustain life as had been lived for thousands of years. So people lived, if people can understand this in the North, one of the things I learned in Ecuador is you can have no money and be very wealthy. Mm-hmm. And I asked my son this when he was young, I'm like, can you imagine being really rich and having no money? And I actually spoke to his elementary school class. People looked at me like, no. And people can't imagine that up here.
Because it's a different program.
It's a different whole ethos, Yeah. So, but because of the pollution, the forest could no longer support life as had been lived for many, many years, many centuries. And the indigenous peoples were forced to leave their lands and go into these nearby towns to try to get wage-paying jobs. And it forced people off their land, which couldn't sustain them. And, with great resilience and great courage, they're maintaining their cultures to the extent that they can. And these are indigenous peoples that are still living, they're alive, their language is alive, but they have been decimated in terms of their ability to live their traditional lifestyle because the forest can't support them, all because of a decision that Texaco executives in the New York area at the time, White Plains, New York, made to do this. I mean, they didn't have to do this. They could have made a lot of money doing it. Like, oil is always somewhat dirty, oil, production, but to not line the pits, to put pipes in the sides of these pits to deliberately run off the excess into rivers and streams that they knew people were drinking out of. I mean, it's horrific. It's unconscionable. Yeah. I mean, and, personally, when I saw this, I knew it would change my life. It's interesting, right? When you see these great injustices and, when I say I couldn't turn my back on it, I don't think I would have respected myself if I had just come home and got a corporate law job.
And then just somehow shut off the consciousness and bury it as if it didn't happen.
Exactly.
And that's a soul. That's a mark on the soul at that point.
It's a mark on the soul. But like, my mom, I had a mother who was super engaged in like civic life. She was an activist basically. And I grew up, upper middle class, and my mom would like organize boycotts in my hometown in solidarity with Cesar Chavez, with the farm workers union when I was a kid. And I just had this switch turned on when like I saw what she was doing. Like it was, I liked it. Like, yeah, that's a fun thing to do.
It's the right thing.
It's the right thing to do. So, all of these things I've been through, including ultimately this prison experience when Chevron actually had me locked up here in the United States. And I'll get to that. But like, people are like, oh, you've sacrificed so much. And the reality is, yeah, there's been some pain, but I don't really consider my life or the work I've done to try to, address this problem and help people to be a sacrifice. I actually have enjoyed the richness of my life and the richness of the experience, even though, of course, there's been a lot of pain involved for me and my family because of what they tried to do to me.
Right. So, I mean, the complexity of this story is unbelievable. But let's cut to, you won. So let's highlight that.
Yeah, we won.
You won. You got them to the Supreme Court of Ecuador.
Yeah, an unanimous decision affirming a $10 billion damages judgment against Chevron for pollution in Ecuador.
Right. And that was unprecedented.
Unprecedented. I mean,
largest ever
environmental judgment out of a trial court. I mean, in the first time Indigenous peoples have taken on a big oil company and won a big legal case. And, my dream has always been to get a remedy primarily for the people of Ecuador. And that's why I've been working on this. But it's also to take the model of what we were doing and apply it. There's so many places around the world where this is happening. I mean, maybe not to this extent, but like you've seen places happening everywhere. And use it to really shift the paradigm of how the fossil fuel industry operates in these vulnerable communities. And I think the reason they have spent literally $3 billion, used 60 law firms, 2,000 lawyers fighting us, is because Chevron recognizes that the model of this case is such a risk to their business model, because this is a business. It's not just Chevron, it's Exxon, it's Shell, it's BP, it's all the big oil companies. Count on the public subsidizing their pollution, meaning they count on taking the profits and then just socializing the costs into these communities by just dumping the shit into the environment. And, California is not immune to that too, as you know. I mean, there's all these abandoned wells in this state that were owned by oil companies, and these are dangerous things that cause pollution, and no one's cleaning them up. So I think we have to recognize as a public, like the way their model really relies on us to subsidize the cleanup of the pollution they cause while they walk home with the profits. And I think because this case challenges that in a fundamental way, and it could be replicated quite easily, I think, they have decided to try to destroy me.
Right. Yeah, because what you're pointing at, and this is one example of a corporation. I just interviewed Chris Hansen from 3M, who discovered PFAS in the 90s and realized that 99% of all humans already had PFAS in their blood.
That's really unbelievable.
Right?
Yeah.
And she was gaslit inside the company, and they were saying it was safe the whole time. Of course, it's 100% not true. So I bring that up to say that there is some sort of game that continues to play at the detriment of humans, of the environment, and somehow has been awarded the strength just because of the weight of money and attorneys. They can, use the legal system to not take responsibility for these things that are wrong. So let's get to that. So that is without dispute what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's the playbook of almost all of them, right? And so you get awarded this case. They haven't paid $1. When was the case awarded?
2013.
Right. So they haven't paid $1.
Yeah.
And so they spun this whole thing and then went after you personally.
Yeah.
So it's so twisted, right? Because on the one hand, it was like a contempt charge, right?
Yeah. So, I'll explain it real briefly so people understand. What happened was, we won the case in Ecuador, affirmed unanimously by Ecuador Supreme Court. By the way, Chevron won the case in Ecuador. We originally filed it in New York. Right. They fought for 10 years to move it to Ecuador.
So already 10 years was
and that means people hurting, dying of cancer, during all these delays. And when they got it to Ecuador, they had promised to accept jurisdiction. They promised to pay any adverse judgment, and they started to fight those earlier promises they had made to a U.S. judge, which the judge conditioned the removal of the case to Ecuador's courts on the fact that they had agreed to pay the judgment. So they then came up with all these, they started this strategy where they were trying to basically attack Ecuador's courts when we were there. They're not treating us fair. And I saw they were setting it up because they knew they were going to lose. The evidence was overwhelming. They were setting it up so they could challenge the judgment after.
So they were making it so that it was all corrupt.
Exactly.
It's not trustable.
Exactly. And it was basically a bait and switch.
Right.
Like they baited the court into getting it to Ecuador where they thought they could just get rid of it. By the way, they had operated there for decades and they had openly polluted, dumping, millions and millions of gallons of this toxic oil waste into the jungle. And there hadn't been a single court case against them. So they felt like in Ecuador, they could just control the system. Right. What they didn't count on is myself and other lawyers coming in and really getting tight with the communities and creating this marriage that the world had never seen before between Amazon indigenous peoples and like highly sophisticated lawyers from the North. I mean, I don't mean to necessarily put myself in that category, but we had a great legal team, really committed to justice. And neither Chevron or any other big oil company ever had to go up against something like that. Right. So it was obvious that we could do this and we had the resources to do this and we had the scientific expertise and all the things you need to win these kinds of cases, to prove them and win them. They then started to attack Ecuador's courts for years and they tried to delay the end of the trial. They did all sorts of subterfuge, shenanigans. For example, one day they filed like 50, 60 motions on the same topic within an hour period. Ecuador has a bizarre law that a judge has to rule on a motion within like 3 days. And if they don't, they can get recused from the case. So they kept getting these judges recused as we were on the verge of ending the case and winning by filing all these motions. And it kept delaying the case. And this went on for years. I mean, took 8 years to finish the case at the trial level in Ecuador. That's why I've been down over 250 times. I mean, I spent a lot of time there, but I got so determined when I started to watch this BS. Right. I'm like, we are not going to lay down, and it was, the whole experience was extremely empowering for everyone involved, including the communities. We kicked their ass legally, and they couldn't take it. And this was the court they wanted it in. Once we won the case, they sued me for the most amount of money any person in this country has ever been sued for, $60 billion. Back in the same court in New York that we had originally filed the underlying environmental case, that they felt like that court was not adequate to litigate that case. That's why he ended up down in Ecuador. They then went back to that same court to sue me personally for the most amount of money anyone's ever been sued for. So I then had to divert my attention. This is called a SLAP lawsuit. It's a harassment lawsuit. I had to divert my attention from fighting them to defending myself. And this has gone on for years.
It's a bad version of a keto in the legal world.
Yeah. But in the end of the day, I kept going and our team kept going and we won a hugely important legal decision in Canadian courts. We'd gone to Canada and filed a case there to enforce the Ecuador judgment against their assets in Canada. Chevron has billions of dollars of assets in Canada. And we won this big Supreme Court decision in Canada in 2015. And after that, I think they decided that they needed to stop me cold. And they concocted this whole theory that I was helping my clients raise money to finance the litigation. And they concocted this whole theory that I shouldn't be allowed to raise money to finance the cost of the litigation for various reasons. I won't get into the details, but the upshot is they got the judge in New York to order me to give them my computer so they could, in theory, see what I was doing with various financing issues for the case, which would have allowed them to see all our strategy. They violate attorney-client privilege, which is, the most important thing when you represent clients. And I told the judge, who, by the way, is very pro-corporate, I said, I can't really give them my computer, so why don't you just hold me in contempt and I'll appeal it to a higher court. So he held me in contempt. I appealed it. And then after that, he charged me with a crime. He charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with an order that I had appealed. I mean, this is crazy stuff. This is crazy land. I mean, this never happened before. And he ended up putting me in jail. And I ended up he ended up confining me in my home with an ankle bracelet, ultimately put me in jail for 6 weeks. And I spent 993 days, almost 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, the formative years of my son's life. He was an adolescent, like age 13 to 16, detained with an ankle bracelet, 6 weeks in prison, fearing for my life. I actually thought they wanted to kill me. And they still have my passport. I got out 2 years ago. I still can't travel, and I can't do my work.
Who has your passport?
The court. The court took my passport at Chevron's request. And the craziest part about this case, this is when it just got nakedly corrupt, in my opinion. Like in other words, we kept beating them. We kept going, and they just had to expose who they really were. They don't play by the rules. So the craziest part is when the judge charged you with criminal contempt of court for not giving them my computer, which is not a valid legal order, in my opinion. He took his charges to the U.S. attorney, the prosecutor, who refused to prosecute me because he thought the case was not valid. The judge then appointed a private corporate law firm to prosecute me and detain me in the name of the U.S. government. This corporate law firm had Chevron as a client. I was put in jail by Chevron, which was able to get the reins of power, the judicial power, governmental power, step into the shoes of the government after the normal prosecutor refused to take the case, and do it themselves. And they put me through hell, and they locked me up. And I'm the only lawyer in the history of this country, there's a lot of firsts in this case, who's ever been locked up for even a minute on it. This is a misdemeanor. It's the lowest level federal offense.
Right.
No one gets locked up. No first-time offender charged with a misdemeanor gets locked up in this country. I got locked up for almost 3 years. It's crazy.
It's unbelievable.
So, the lesson is they will break the, we obey the rules. I mean, they'll respect court decisions as long as they win, okay?
Right.
When they lose, they don't respect the rule of law. They don't respect court decisions. They start to try to wield their power. And in this case, in my opinion, they undermine the entire rule of law system to have me locked up so they could evade paying these people, these indigenous peoples in Ecuador, the money they owe them so they can clean up their ancestral lands.
Right. So they used this weird contempt thing, right? They were trying to say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're trying to, by you helping them raise money for their case, they're saying they're trying to spin it to you were like some sort of racketeering thing where you were paying them off or paying the judge off or whatever that. Yeah. And then he ended up, the judge at one point in Ecuador said it, right? But then redacted. Yeah.
Retracted it. Yeah.
So it's very
well, what it was. Okay. So what they did, it's crazy. They wanted to criminalize me.
Sure.
Like the way they could avoid paying the people in Ecuador that they poisoned was to claim that the lawyer who represented them did something really wrong.
Right.
Okay.
Which undermines everything.
It undermines everything. Right. So they had to create this fake, what I would call a fake narrative. By the way, this is my point of view. I can back all this up, but if people want to hear their point of view, go to their website. They got their story too. I want to be fair about this, but I'm just telling you, this is what happened. Right. They created this fake narrative. How did they do it? They got a witness in Ecuador to whom they paid at least $2 million. His name is Alberto Guerra. He was a former judge in Ecuador and I knew this man because he was the presiding judge on this case I'm
So you
describing.
have a paper trail already that they had paid him.
Yeah, they've admitted it.
Right.
They've admitted it. But I mean, I think they paid him actually a lot more because he's living near in the United States now. They bought him a house. They pay his income taxes. He's on their payroll. Like, it's called hush money, to keep him cool. And he was part of this scheme by Chevron to commit fraud against us and me so they could evade paying the people of Ecuador. Right. But their fake narrative was that we had committed a fraud. I mean, this gets kind of crazy. And this judge testified after Chevron's lawyers prepped him for 53 days. They coached him for 53 days. By the way, when you have to coach a witness 53 days, you're coaching someone to lie, okay? This guy got up there and claimed he was in a meeting where I approved of a bribe by our local counsel of the trial judge. Completely false. And they paid this guy to say this. The judge you heard it, the same judge who ended up locking me up, very pro-corporate judge, had denied me a jury. And he was ruling about all this. And he credited this guy's testimony and wrote up an opinion that is now a judicial opinion that I bribed the judge in Ecuador. But it's been rejected by the entire Supreme Court of Ecuador, the entire Supreme Court of Canada, actually 6 different appellate courts and 28 appellate judges. There's one trial judge in the U.S. who made this finding, and Chevron constantly talks about this to try to undermine the legitimacy of our case. But it's very interesting to watch. It's sort of like scorched earth politics applied to the law, where they just decided to try to destroy me as a way to distract attention from the crimes they had committed.
Right. And that's ultimately, because I just want to touch on that because it sets this up, and of course we can talk so much. And number one, I'm sorry that you've gone through all that.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate you saying that.
And I'm also sorry that they haven't had, I'm listening to this and 9.5 billion, and we give numbers to things when things are impossible to even give numbers to.
Yeah, exactly.
When people's lives have been lost, when they've been deformed, when children
and it's
die
not just
of cancer.
People, it's all the other species.
The world. Yeah.
It's the species. I mean, the animals in the forest, the biodiversity, the trees, it's all been like really hit hard by this pollution.
Of course.
Everybody's hurting. And I say that because the indigenous peoples, and one thing I learned by going down there so much, like the connectedness between the indigenous peoples in Ecuador, indigenous peoples throughout the world, and the natural ecosystem is so tight.
Yeah.
It's something that gets generally beaten out of Americans. We're not educated that way. We're not raised that way.
Right.
We're raised in a very sort of, we look at nature as something to be commercially exploited, not something to really be, we're part of nature. I mean, and so to see the level of suffering when your entire way of being, your entire way of thinking, your entire culture gets completely destroyed by this greedy company that wanted to make just a little bit more money when they were already making a lot.
Right.
And I wanted to tell people, your listeners, that, this is still out there. Like, you can go down to this part of the Amazon and see it. You can see these open air waste pits.
Still.
It hasn't been cleaned up because they refused to pay this judgment. And, we won the case. They refused to pay. So there are lawyers. I want people to know this case is not over. Like, people are still working on it to get it enforced against their assets, hopefully in different countries around the world, in a way that they will actually have to comply with the rule of law, pay the judgment, so the people who have fought so hard and so long and so heroically to get this judgment will get the money that they have won so they can clean up. And in the meantime, people are really hurting.
Yeah, big time. And this is, again, this is kind of the fatal flaw of the modernized world, like you said. Like, where I look out and I see cars going on in PCH, and you're like, well, a lot of that oil is in the gas tank of the cars that we're even looking at right now. And we don't know that. We're disconnected from, just like the lithium from our batteries, the African slave, really the volunteer labor that is just horrific conditions of just mining. So it extends so deep, and the corporate veil is so wide, and there's products are created with no life tax to them, from the PFAS to the plastics to the clothing to the petroleum to all this stuff. And it's like that's where the kind of this democracy of corporations has just kind of done whatever they want with no, and to the point where even when you win, and even when you expose this stuff, and even when we talk about it, people will even now be shutting this off.
Yeah.
Because they just want to go to work and they just want to go home and they just want to drive their car. So it feels so large. It feels so overwhelming. How do you then, I guess maybe the advice that you have, like, let's ground it right now, and we'll go back into other parts of the story. So what are things, just maybe first start off of, what are things that you see people can do to maybe have a greater integrated life, to have less pressure on these very things that are continuously being destructively generated for us to live our life? Like, what's some of those things that you now think about, and how can we, as, because it's not lost on me that when you unified the people there, numbers are powerful.
Oh yeah.
And I always go back to, like, the billions of people that we have, way more than the few choices of the executive boards.
So true.
We have the numbers. So how do we, as the numbers, the people listening, how can we mobilize change?
I think it's good to start with numbers because, one thing I've noticed in the work I've done is those who sort of control a lot of power in our society. I mean, fossil fuel industry is one example, pharmaceutical industry. I would say the corporate media. They don't want us to think we have the power. I mean, actually, what they want us to think is we can't do this. They want us to think we shouldn't even start and waste our time because we'll never get it done.
Right.
So just focus on what you're doing. Don't worry about these bigger issues. Go to the beach, do whatever, and don't even think about this stuff.
Eat your Cheerios.
Eat your Cheerios, watch your NFL football this fall. I mean, like, really get really distracted. It's all about you, baby, And I think it's, and by the way, those who do that, I understand it. I really do, because I do it sometimes. Like, I just have to tune out, and I'm like, I'm just going to sit on the couch this weekend and, watch sports. I love sports, by the way. So maybe a bad analogy, but, like, we do have the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay. And we need to organize, mobilize, and that starts with understanding that we have power. And their goal is to convince us that we don't have power. And one of the biggest sins in life, in my opinion, is when you don't use the leverage you have. But one thing I learned in this case is you can create leverage. Like, it's not like you walk into the world with leverage. I mean, how do we create leverage? I mean, in Ecuador, when we started, I was told by this extremely prominent oil union president that we could never win the case. I mean, it's just, you can't win this case in this country. And I started to really think about what he was telling me. And I'm like, well, that might be how it is today. But we can do things today and the next year and the next year to change that so we can win the case. Right. And so we adopted a strategy in Ecuador that was what I would call multi-platform advocacy. Like, the legal case was just a piece of it, most important piece. But we engaged the media, we organized the communities, we, took trips to different cities around Ecuador to explain the case. Because Ecuadorians have been kept in the dark about how their country had essentially been extremely violated by Texaco. I mean, any Ecuadorian, no matter what your social class, upon seeing what they did, were like, this is crazy. And we basically turned
This happening in our country.
This is an outrage.
And I didn't even know.
And I didn't even
you guys
know.
Told us.
Exactly. And what was interesting is, at the beginning of the case, it was like, oh, the Amazon Indians are suing Texaco. And Texaco was a big brand in Ecuador. I mean, it was like the most important investor in the whole country. Like, oh, the Indians are suing Texaco. And, like, no one gave a shit. because there's a lot of racism in Ecuador against indigenous peoples. And we're like, no, this is a case of Ecuador against Texaco, not the Amazon Indians against Texaco. This is a case of your country standing up for its sovereignty, its self-respect, its environment, its trees, its water, its people, okay? Connect with this.
Right.
And we went around with this message all over the country, and like, it was crazy. Like, this became like the biggest thing in the country. You could get into a taxi in some, small town and people, oh, you're the lawyer, and people really got mobilized, and it really unleashed an energy that led to significant empowerment. And I think ultimately led to an environment where the court system in Ecuador could actually rule on the facts and the law without being freaked out that someone in Texaco would kill the judge,
Right.
So that the courts could do their job correctly. And I think that kind of understanding of the different levers that people can create to create the leverage we need to solve some of these big problems is really important. I'm telling you, it's not taught in school.
Right.
It's not taught in law school. I'll go around to law schools. Law schools invite me to speak all the time. There's no class in this.
Right.
They don't teach you how to do this.
Right.
But you can do this. I mean, this is an area of the law that is totally viable.
Yeah.
But they want you to graduate from law school with massive debt and then basically be a wage slave to a corporate law firm to pay back your debt. They don't want people thinking that they can do this kind of work.
Right.
But you can. So I think in any of these issues you're talking about, I think understanding how we can unite, pull together, and also connect the dots, right? Like we have an election in November. Okay. I don't want to get into that in too much detail other than to say there is a connection to the preservation of our freedoms and whatever is left of our democracy in this country, and the ability to do this work,
Right.
the ability to advocate, the ability to take on injustice, the ability to fight for justice, to save the planet, or whatever issue people are working on.
Yeah.
PFAS,
Yeah.
Is a massive problem. And it's really only because corporations don't give a damn about us. It's really, they are structured to maximize profits. And if they can offload their problems to the rest of us, like Chevron did in Ecuador, and think they can get away with it, they will do that. That's how they operate. And we need to understand how to connect the dots, to understand this corporate power. Corporations, the corporate sector has gained so much power in our society. I've seen this my whole career.
Yeah.
Think back to the days of when Jimmy Carter was president. Ralph Nader was a hero in this country, protecting consumers. And like all that has just gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
So we have some serious issues and challenges. We can do this. We have, as you point out, we have the numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. We've been born into this.
Yeah.
We all have. And you look at the history, right? You look at the history of Texaco, you look at the history of 3M, you look at the history of the shift of industrial agriculture and subsidizing your McDonald's beef patty.
Right.
And like, again, more offload, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately we're paying for it. So
we're paying for it.
So the thing that is, I think, to your point, the narratives that are put out there around you can't do anything and or you're educated to do it this way, don't question this, and really it goes against the real foundation of our own country.
Yeah.
Right? Tea Party. Like what happened there? Like mobilizing people to get real information. It's happening now again. The pillars of some of those societies of legacy media and all of those things, like, if you don't realize that they're being spoon-fed the messages to tell the public, then you're not willing to look, and that's fine. Yeah. There might be a few of those people left on the planet, but I know for me and for a lot of people I see, to varying degrees, you're waking up as a result of what's wrong.
Yeah.
To then mobilize and make changes as to what's right and moral. And, if there's anything I believe, going back to those numbers, I do believe we all want the same thing.
Yeah.
I really do. And again, it's like, my dad suffered from multiple chemical sensitivity in the 90s, right? So he was he was a tenured professor, and he all of a sudden couldn't cognitively think. He had depression from chemicals in our environment. That was when I got exposed. I was in college in the 90s. So I started seeing like, why is this dangerous? And why are we buying this? And why is it out there?
Right.
Right. So I say that because we're born into this. And I don't say when people are listening to your story going, wow, how the hell is this possible?
Yeah.
I don't know, but it is happening.
Yeah.
And it's happening. Take a dart right now, almost anywhere in the globe, some corporation is taking, horrible, like they're making horrible choices that are affecting people over their health and moreover wanting wanting profit and power over the health and safety of people.
Yeah.
That is tough to swallow.
Yeah.
Right? But, in order to change anything, we have to face it.
Yeah.
And just like you were in the middle of the Amazon seeing these pits of destruction, and then literally the downstream effect of that's facing something. And then we have to change it. So in terms of like, I've had several conversations. I've had Naomi Orseki's on environmental badass, and also, there's this, climate change and stuff, and I hate the political terms of that. But this is where I like to have this conversation because I'm a small town kid. So if you don't think we and corporations are having destructive results on the planet, then let's jump on a plane. Let's go to those pits in the Amazon. Do we know all of the levers of how we're hurting this planet? No, but we certainly can see many.
Yes.
So that is a human environmental change that has been instigated by choice, and that is destroying the Amazon, the heart of the world, the precious indigenous, multicultural, multilingual population.
And the frontline defenders of the natural world.
Exactly.
400 million indigenous people. They are the frontline defenders.
So
of the planet.
Their life has changed as a result of the human activity on our environment.
That's exactly right.
Right? So, how can people help with this situation? Because how can people help you? How can people help this situation? What can people do to mobilize some action? I know what's his name? The Jungle Keepers guy. Do you know that guy?
Jungle Keepers.
Jungle Keepers. So it's a nonprofit. They're buying up land when they can.
Okay.
And then protecting it from the logging and the destruction of the Amazon, Peruvian Amazon. Paul Rosley.
I don't know Paul.
But there's things that we can do. What can people do here that can help maybe take some of the apathy that they're even feeling now after hearing this story firsthand from you, having fought it for 30 years? What can people do, and how do you think the alarms are sounding? Like
they are literally sounding as we sit here.
Because we do have power, man.
We do have power.
And how do you think, from your massive experience, what do you think are the best rules of power that we can?
Well, I would say this, people who want to help, first, you got to open up to what's really happening. And I salute you for this, having a platform like you have to sort of bring these issues to the attention of a lot of people. But it's not just you. There's like people doing this type of thing all over the place. So we have access to more information now than we've ever had if you just open up and go get it, okay? And don't rely on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, like those are the media outlets. That's all we had growing up. I mean, until the internet came,
And they were at one point pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I still read the New York Times every day just because I got to feel what they're all thinking, you know what I mean? And how they sort of curate the news in a deceptive way.
That's the attorney in you. You got to understand your
exactly.
opponent.
That's exactly right. But, first get information from good sources.
Right.
Number two, there are massive efforts to, I would say, defraud the public by certain legacy media operations who make money off of creating, fake issues, fake conflict, and I think people just need to be aware not to fall prey to that. I mean, it's a daily effort for me to like decolonize and decontaminate my brain from all the crap out there and really focus on the real issues and get the right information, like the 3M issue and the PFAS issue. Like they're not writing about it that much because they don't want people to know that every water system in this country is poisoned.
Yes.
So, you know what I mean? So, so get the information. And then I would say if you want to help and you can't, if you're busy with your job but want to make, say, a financial contribution to those doing the work, look for organizations that take on corporate abuse, the corporations. There's a lot of groups out there, and they're all worthy, like the Nature Conservancy, buy up land. Yeah. That's all great, but they have a ton of money. Right. The groups that really need the resources, in my opinion, based on my experience, are the groups that really do the frontline work, taking on the mining companies, the oil companies, the gas companies, that are, the chemical companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the companies that are really hurting us in deep, deep ways. Yeah. So look for the groups that fight corporate power. And then in terms of the Ecuador case, I want to emphasize it's still alive. And we are in the process. We need resources to follow through and get the money for the people down in Ecuador. And we have a crowdfunding site, which I would like to mention if I could. It's called chuffed.org, CHUFFED.org.
And we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah. So there's that. And then there's my personal situation where I have constant legal fees. And by the way, I didn't mention this yet, but Chevron took I don't have a bank account. Chevron took all my money because they got this judge who was after me to order me to pay them millions of dollars that I don't have. I'm a human rights lawyer, to reimburse them for some of their legal fees they used to get me locked up. So I never paid that money because I don't have it. But it's hard for me to work and have like a paid job because they would just get the money. So I'm heavily dependent. This is crazy. I'm heavily dependent on donations. So I set up a crowdfunding site called chuffed.org, CHUFFED. And we've raised a fair amount of money from thousands of people. And then I also have a legal defense fund. But the best way to find this is go to chuffed.org, the crowdfunding. If you want to sort of learn more about the case, I have a website called freedonziger.com, DONZIGER. So those are the two sites. By the way, if people, times are tough. If you're not into like the donation thing, go to the site anyway. Give us your email. We send out a newsletter about the case, and it's really important that people get involved and sort of sign up for two reasons. One is, courts see when people are engaged with certain issues, and it actually affects legal cases. Like if a judge knows a lot of people are watching, that judge is going to think differently about a case.
Socially,
let's not kid ourselves.
There's a muscle socially.
There is a muscle. Absolutely. And we understood that in Ecuador. It's one reason why we were able to get the judge to actually move the case. And the second issue is the more Chevron notices that people support my personal struggle to protect my freedom and my welfare and that of my family, the less incentive they have to really go after me. Like it's weird, but like the more, like even doing this podcast with you helps me because you have influence, and Chevron doesn't want to go through people of influence to get to me, and I think one of the reasons they had me locked up, in 2019 is I hadn't set up enough support and solidarity, and I was vulnerable, and they decided that it would be worth it to go try to bring me down. Turned out that, by locking me up, I got more attention, and it gave me a bigger platform to tell the story like I'm doing today. So ultimately, I think I strengthened my hand considerably by getting locked up, even though I hated the experience. So I'm much stronger now, but I have to constantly keep talking this up because people don't know about this.
Right, they don't know.
So anyway, it's freedonziger.com and chuff.org.
Yeah, amazing. What broader question, or it could be the same.
Mm-hmm.
What does a super life mean to you?
Well, look, I think everyone has it within them, no matter what the circumstances, of really finding their mission. I mean, I think it's really important for people to live a mission-driven life. And by that, I don't mean make as much money as you can. I mean,
Right.
that is a mission of a lot of
Purpose,
people.
yeah.
And it's what we're sort of conditioned to want,
Right.
So, but I think life is so much more satisfying. And by the way, I'm not opposed to making money. I mean, it's cool.
Of course
Okay.
not.
Yeah, obviously. But do it out of a result of some mission that helps others. We have a lot of people hurting in this world. We have a lot of people hurting in America, in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
There's people hurting. Okay, in Malibu, there's people hurting. In New York City, you can't believe the people sleeping on the street right now. And how is it that we generate so much wealth in this world and in this country, and we let this happen? And, in my opinion, we need to spread around the resources in a much more equitable way. And I think there's so many ways to live a mission-driven life and sort of address these fundamental issues that are really hurting our country and hurting our world and hurting our planet. And I think people need to not get distracted by the circus of Washington. There's going to be intense media coverage of the election between now and November, and it's all designed to suck people in and make it look like it's some sort of horse race, when I would say neither of the two parties are really dealing with the fundamental issues affecting us. We need to create alternative sources of power, through nonprofits and through what you can do in your local community. One of my favorite groups is in Oakland, Amazon Watch. They've helped the Ecuadorian communities for years, and they are one of these groups that confront corporate power. In AmazonWatch.org, if you want to check them out. And they work with indigenous groups throughout the Amazon, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and elsewhere. And there's just certain people and groups, you being one of them really, who are out there like dealing with this stuff. And so people need to do what they can within their circumstances. By the way, if you're struggling paycheck to paycheck, I get it. Like, you probably don't have time to do this, but even in our daily life, we can do the little things that I think give us a sense of mission in a world where all of social conditioning is designed to, it's about you, make as much money as you can. And that's why we're in these situations.
Yeah.
So we collectively have the numbers, as you point out, I think to really change that. And everyone has a role to play in that.
Mm. I agree 100%. And going back to, if people don't have resources, it feels overwhelming. They're living day to day.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people. But going back to the purpose driven, the mission driven, you can put 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, build upon what you care about with no need for money. Find what your heart wants to do. Find a serviceable thing that you can get involved with, and that power creates another opportunity and that snowball effect is very, very powerful. And I'll just say, to the political side, the light bulb went off for me probably 2004 or 5, when I was starting to see places from India to Africa to Amazon, when I was like, why am I, this white dude, showing up in all these places and people don't have water, power, food, shelter?
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm addressing what you were saying. I'm not interested in taking my energy from the political ups, because they've already failed. They've failed almost every generation of every election, from my point of view. UN, you call it. They've already failed. They haven't addressed the humanity's problems, right? They haven't addressed this.
Exactly.
Because there's billions of people struggling right now, today, and who are not, have no one to listen to them, have no other way out, who are the victim, major victim of a downstream effect of these massive corporations and choices.
Yeah.
So that's a failure. And to your point, I don't care who gets elected.
Yeah.
I want us as people to come together.
Yes.
I want us to come together and solve these problems. Solve these things, the things that you saw, the things I've seen, the other things that people have seen. You don't have to save everything. What do you care about?
Yeah.
And then just start learning about it, and that's a step.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So I get, dude, I applaud you, because it's impossible to understand all you've been through in 30 years.
Thank you.
Impossible.
Thank you.
But you're here, you're positive, you're unrelenting.
Well, thank you, man. We won.
Yeah.
And they're not going to take that from me.
Right.
That brings a smile to my face, and it empowers people.
Right.
And I don't give a shit what they want to say about me. They can put me in jail for the rest of my life. We won, and they're not going to get that smile off my face. I'm fundamentally an optimistic person. I recognize I'm in danger, but it's like, you do what you can with what you have, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what you're saying. And I think, again, we all have a role to play. I mean, it so happens I got into this huge situation and kept going, and here I am today. But there's so many more manageable things that we can contribute to, as you point out, a few minutes a day.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. You're a warrior. I appreciate
Thank you, man. I appreciate all you do. And, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my story.
Yeah, brother. Cheers.
Yeah.